Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Mark Matousek, and Mark is the award-winning author of 8 books, including Sex, Death and Enlightenment and Writing to Awaken. In his work as a teacher, Mark focuses on personal awakening and self-inquiry. He brings over 3 decades of experience as a memoirist, editor, interviewer, survivor, activist, and spiritual seeker to his penetrating and thought-provoking work with students. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you, John. It's really good to be with you.
Mark, I was just saying, just before we started, that I've just been, the last couple of days, been getting into your book, Sex, Death and Enlightenment, and it's really pulled me right in there. So I've loved reading that. And
I'm glad to hear it.
And I've hoped, I hope that maybe we could do a couple of things today. Firstly, talk about some of your story, and then the turning points and the influences, and then get on to Writing to Awaken and your work there. So maybe I can hand over to you for a second.
Well, I grew up in a house where there was a lot of pain and difficulty and confusion, which is the perfect kind of breeding ground for a seeker. Because while there was pain and there was confusion, there were also a lot of questions. So from a very young age, I found myself asking existential questions, the kinds of questions kids in more fortunate circumstances aren't bothered with. Things like, who am I? What am I doing here? What is the meaning of all of this? Those sorts of questions were burning in me as a little kid because I was in the midst of so much difficulty and violence and confusion. So I'm actually grateful for my tough childhood. It turned me into a writer, it turned me into a seeker, and somebody who, in the end, was grateful for what I had. The upside of not being privileged is that you understand when life is giving you gifts. You don't feel like it's coming to you. It's something you're deeply grateful for in a way that a lot of other folks weren't. So I'm grateful for the difficulties of my early life. I'm glad that I survived it. It got me on the path of self-discovery, and it gave me a lot of great material. I mean, that's the wonderful thing for a memoirist. There's nothing like a childhood like mine, to give you the kinds of experiences that you can explore for the rest of your life, and keep going and discovering new depths and importance there.
I was thinking when I was reading, your book, I was thinking, we often talk, well, in this podcast, I might speak to a lot of people who have PhDs often, and we often talk about qualifications through education, being qualified and being a licensed Jungian therapist and Zurich trained and all that. But, when I went to India, someone said to me, you're experienced or something. And I've always taken that to mean that some people just have a lot of experiences, and that in its way, it's kind of a qualification. It's a good qual, and as you say, for a memoirist, maybe the best qualification.
Yeah, life experience.
Hmm.
There's no question. My resume has never gotten me a job. My resume has never opened doors or helped me have, most of the interesting experiences that I have had. I kind of learned on the street, and even though
Hmm.
I have a master's degree, I've never used it in any way that shaped my life. It's always come from the people I've known, the accidental serendipitous meetings, and the hardship that one has
Hmm.
endured. I mean, that's what deepens you as a human being. It's certainly what gives you perspective and momentum as a writer, and it's what drives the seeker's life.
Hmm.
So I don't. In fact, I stopped. I started university intending to get a PhD, And 2 weeks into the program, I said, this is not for me. I was looking at all these PhD candidates. They were so miserable. And they complained about not being able to live their lives. And they would end up in some, podunk place teaching English comp to, teenagers and hating what they were. And I just knew that it wasn't for me. So I did the master's in a year and got to New York as fast as I could and went into journalism instead, which gives you that kind of, great
Street
life
smarts,
experiences. Yeah, street smarts.
to use a jargon. Um, yeah, but I was also interested to know, when did you first start writing? Like, what age were you? When did you kind of get this inkling that it was a big thing for you?
Honestly, I started writing when I was in, I think maybe the second or third grade. I was about 7 or 8 years old. I discovered writing, and it happened for me because there was so much confusion around me. The only way I could level myself and steady myself was by writing things down. And so I would sit with what you would call a journal. Usually it was just a piece of paper, sometimes a piece of paper towel. It didn't matter what I was writing on. And I would just scribble and scribble and scribble until I could start to make sense of things. And what I found, John, was that no matter what was going on around me, even if the exterior hadn't changed at all, I always felt better after I wrote. I felt more grounded, I felt centered. And so that for me was the big turning point, realizing that asking questions gave me power, and that when I wrote, there was kind of a witness in me. There was another part of my mind that was observing me, observing my experience, trying to understand it. Now I understand it's called metacognition. There are names for these things. At the time, all I knew was that I had access to something that was a little stronger, a little clearer, and a little smarter than this confused little boy. And so I got hooked at a very young age. So I've been journaling since then. I've been journaling for over 50 years, more like 60 years now. And it has been my lifesaver. It's been my confidant. It's been my great support and comfort. And I honestly don't know how people who don't have an outlet like that, and of course it doesn't have to be writing, it can be dialogue with friends, it can be just reflecting, it can be deep reading. But I don't understand how folks who don't have that, some kind of an outlet for understanding their experience, go through life without going crazy. It's just things are so complex. There's so much pain, there's so much uncertainty. I
Mm,
just don't know how folks cope
mm.
without some form of self-inquiry.
The Greeks have that word, the temenos, or that it was like a walled garden or a sacred place where you could go and think about things. And, that's what I was thinking as you were talking there. It's that kind of place to center as well, or go back to essential things or the deepest things. Or, yeah, I
Yeah,
agree with you. Without that, it's like being off center if there's too much out there in the world of action all the
yeah,
time, you know?
yeah, yeah. No, it was a sanctuary for me. It was a real refuge for me. When
Mm,
people in the Buddhist world talk about taking refuge in the Dharma, I can relate because I took refuge in writing. I
yeah.
took refuge in self-reflection. And asking questions became my primary spiritual practice. And it's so interesting when we look back at your life and you see these common themes that have been there from the beginning. I've always been somebody who was incredibly curious and indefatigable and asker of questions. I'd ask everyone questions. I'd bug people. I'd tell me your story. How do you do it? And that's the way I always was. And that was a great preparation for a career as a journalist, and
Mm,
then as a memoir writer, and now as an author and a teacher. I'm
mm,
still asking people questions and still using questions. Writing to Awaken, which is the method that I teach. I know we'll talk about that later, but it's all about inquiry,
yeah.
and realizing that we have this. I think of it as a kind of a superpower, really. This ability to interrogate ourselves and interrogate our experience. Uh, there's nothing more effective when you're moving through your life than stepping back and asking yourself, what is true here? What is real? What am I feeling now? How am I separated from myself? You know, uh, the questions, keep coming, and it's what I most love to do with students is go into a deep, penetrating question and answer, a kind of a Socratic dialogue method
with yourself.
with myself and with my students.
Right. Okay, well, let's go back to your story for a second. So in the beginning of your book, Sex, Death, Enlightenment, you've walked into the factory, Andy Warhol's factory. That was, I suppose, a lot of people, and then you got a job there. I suppose a lot of people would have, killed for that job, didn't they?
Well, yes, and they would have. And when I eventually left that job, people thought I was crazy. But no, at the time, it was a real gift for me. I needed a job. I knew somebody who taught aerobics to the editor of Interview magazine. It was just one of these long shot things. I'll never forget walking into the factory in my three-piece corduroy suit, and
Very
and
hip.
and meeting the editor. And the first thing he said when he looked at my resume, which I was still using at that time, he said, "Get out of here. You're a writer. You want to be a writer. You don't want to be here. The last thing Andy cares about is words and language. And so thanks for coming in." And just then, the woman he worked with asked me about myself and asked if I wanted to take just a kind of a day gig as a copy editor. And I really needed the money. So for $65 a day, I took that job, and it became, over the next 3 years, I eventually became the senior editor at the magazine. I got to meet a lot of extraordinary people. But the editor had been right when he said it wasn't a good place for me, because even though it paid the bills, and there was a kind of cachet and kind of status to it, I was inwardly very unhappy and unsatisfied with what I was doing. I wanted to be a writer. I cared about things like philosophy and psychology, and all they cared about was, Calvin Klein's latest poster boy, and who was famous and who was rich and who was the latest hot thing. And that's really demoralizing. When you see fame up close, you realize how shallow and tinny it is. The phrase that all the glitters isn't gold really really is true. You see these people for what they are, which is ordinary human beings with flaws like the rest of us, but hugely inflated egos. So the difference between how people were seeing the famous and what the famous were actually like behind the scenes was glaring to me and really disillusioning in the true sense of the word. So I couldn't wait to get out of there eventually.
But still, you would have had exposure to lots of people in the sense that, uh, like, you would have met some interesting people
I did.
as well, for sure.
I did. I did. The thing about interview, the Andy's gag, or the kind of thing that made it unique was that Andy would have famous people interview other famous people. But because they were famous people, they didn't know how to work a tape recorder or write an introduction. So I would be the one who would go along for these interviews and turn on, make sure the tape recorder was working, and then I would edit the pieces and do introductions. So I got to meet a lot of fantastic people, hugely talented people. And in retrospect, as often happens in life, in retrospect, I didn't realize at the time how special it was. But
Yeah.
in the years since then, with Andy dying, it's become history. This whole interview period, people ask me about it. At the time, it was just a job, a pretty poorly paid job, where we were worked to the bone. But in truth, I was also getting to speak to some great artists, and spend time with Andy Warhol, who was a very brilliant person. He wasn't my kind of person, but he was undoubtedly a genius. And if you have to have a day job, working for someone like that and getting to, talk to fascinating people from all walks of life, was a a privileged thing.
Lately I've spoken to a few people like Richard Tarnas, who became what is it, kind of like the director of studies or the program director at Esalen. And I remember with James Hillman, who I like, he was the director of studies at Unions. But these things of dealing with a lot of people is actually kind of the way that they learned so much stuff, it seems. That, Richard Tarnas came in contact with the Joseph Campbells and the this and that, and you pick up a lot in a way.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And it's important to know when to move on.
Yeah,
So, you
exactly.
benefit from it, you enjoy the time, but one of my mantras in life is don't miss the exit. You need to know when it's time to go. Otherwise, you turn into, you stay too long at the fair and you get
Yeah,
bitter and you feel trapped. And I was really lucky because a crisis happened in my life at a time when I was really unhappy working at the magazine, and it was the push I needed
yeah.
to kind of let go of the golden handcuffs. And I went to India, and I feel like that's when my life as a writer really started.
Can you expand upon that a little? I mean, what do you mean?
Well, sure. I was I was 28. I was working at Interview, and I met a writer named Andrew Harvey, who's he's a wonderful scholar and mystic. And he walked into my office and he took one look at me and he said, "You're having a spiritual crisis." And I said, "What do you mean a spiritual crisis?" I never thought of in those terms. And he
Mm.
said, "You are having a crisis of meaning. I can see it all over your face." Anyway, cut to 3 months later, we were on a plane together to India. I quit my job. He had invited me to come with him. And we stopped on the way to India, and I met a woman named Mother Mira, who is an amazing spiritual figure. I knew nothing about her, and I started having these experiences that I couldn't explain. And that was the bedrock. That was kind of the foundation for my spiritual life, was meeting Mother Mira, who we can talk about certainly. And then we went to India and spent 3 months, and I was exposed, as we were talking about before we began.
Yeah.
India blows your mind. India, if you're right for it, if you're hungry for it, India just blows the top of your head off. And I was absolutely
Ready?
fascinated and intrigued, but also disgusted. All of these intense feelings that one has there. But the important one was that in India, the transcendent is ordinary. It's
Mm,
understood that life has an unseen dimension, that
mm,
philosophy matters, that
mm,
our purpose here is to know ourselves, not just to make more money and interview Calvin Klein's latest model. So
mm,
for me, it was like coming home in a certain kind of way. And I realized that many of the things I thought were wrong with me were actually my qualifications as a seeker. You know, being oversensitive, asking too many questions, not being satisfied with the appearances of things, feeling like there had to be a deeper meaning. These were things that had been with me since I was a little kid. I kind of came in with them. And all of a
which
sudden in India,
which
I
kind of
realized,
makes you in India, that kind of makes you a rishi or a
well,
saint
it
or
makes
something,
you,
because that's what they do. That's how they think.
that's how they think. I mean, what it was for me, John, was like finding my tribe. I felt like I had found my tribe.
Yeah.
Oh, that's why I run something now called the Seekers Forum, because to me that's really my essential family, is people who are interested in awakening and moving past the superficial dimension of life to something that is deeper and more eternal. And that was always my hunger, even though I didn't have language for it. And that's what I found in India. I said, ah, this
It's
is sanity.
the great breath of fresh air, because
Yeah,
hey,
exactly.
there's a language for it, and not only that, there's a full participation in it, and um, uh, people are in that space. And sometimes I think, like, I don't know, what is it in psychological language, you maybe have a little bit of a persona when I was younger, say, for example, and the spiritual leanings weren't quite socially acceptable. And so you might think, oh, that's a bit of a weird part of myself or something like that. And then to go to India is like, hey, there's lots of weird people then, because just
Yeah.
about everyone here is into that.
But then the question is, what do you do with that when you get home and when you're
Yeah,
back in your familiar context? I didn't
exactly.
want to become a Hare Krishna.
Yeah.
I wasn't a monastic. I
Mm,
wanted to integrate this material, this information, these insights into my daily life.
mm,
And that was hard because
yeah.
unless you are an identified Christian or Jew, or now being a Buddhist is sort of okay, you were just tossed into the New Age pile.
Mm,
And I had this real fear of being perceived as a New Age woo-woo kind of person, which I'm not. I'm actually a very skeptical person.
mm.
But finding my legs, spiritually speaking, in the West was a big challenge. I also had to get over some of my own spiritual ego, because having sort of glimpsed these possibilities, I wanted everyone to be interested in them. And if
Yeah,
they weren't,
which
then
is natural. It's just that a lot of people aren't interested.
and I looked down on them. And I'll
Mm.
never forget. I looked down on them, and I'm embarrassed to say now. No, I did. I thought I did. I remember going out with somebody, and they were asking me about India, and I was talking about the glories of mysticism and enlightenment and spiritual philosophy and non-duality, and they're just looking at me like I was out of my mind. And all of a sudden, he said, "Do you mean kindness?" And I said, "Oh boy, I've got a ways to go, because my spiritual ego was kind of out of control." And a lot of seekers have that experience. You have a glimpse of something and you want to share it, but the ego has a way of co-opting it and turning you into someone very, very special for having had a tiny little insight.
A
So I had to
taste.
get over that, and he busted me really quick. I'm glad it happened. It was humiliating and embarrassing, but it
Yeah.
kind of popped my bubble in a moment when I really needed that.
Mm.
And I saw I need to figure out what to make of this that's true and authentic and grounded, and not airy fairy intellectual thing that's kind of sets me apart or above other people. That's obviously the opposite of spirituality.
I think there's this thing of maybe flying off, in my language, flying off into the lofty world of the spirit. And it's a superbia, it's a taste of the superb. It's an up the mountain kind of spirituality, maybe. And then there's the thing about getting your feet on the ground. But as soon as you come back to the West, maybe a lot of people will help you in that process of trying to get your feet back onto the ground, because, uh, it's a shock. Um, but I mean, how did you do all that? What was the thing when you returned, when you went back to New York? What was the guts of it?
It was one day at a time. It was uncomfortable and difficult. It was also a time in my life when I had gotten a diagnosis that was really scary, and so I thought that my days were numbered. So I went through a period of about 10 years that were intensely frightening, and also growthful. I mean, they were both the most exciting, interesting years of my life and the most terrifying.
Mm.
And so that's what my life was like for a full decade. That's when I started writing Sex, Death, Enlightenment, because I wanted to write a book for people like myself. I didn't want to preach to the choir. I
Mm.
wanted to write a book for all the people I knew in New York City in their little cubicles, who were miserable, chasing the golden ring, and feeling like their lives were like they were wasting their lives. I wanted to write a book for cynical, skeptical people like I was. And so I worked on Sex Ed Enlightenment for 10 years. That helped to ground me, but it was
And
hard.
was it hard? Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you. You're very truthful, and it's not always easy to be truthful, is it? It's like you have to own up to bits of your shadow, which is kind of like you'd rather not in
Oh
one
yeah.
way.
No, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. To be honest with you, at my advanced age now, I look back at that book and I can't believe I said some of the things that I did. I'm glad I wrote it when I was young because I wouldn't say a lot of that stuff now. But it needed it. It needed the grit. It needed that level of self-disclosure. And
Mm.
also, I had been waiting my whole life. This was by then I was in my late 30s, and I'd been waiting my whole life to write a book. So I had a lot to prove to myself and a lot that I wanted to share. So the first draft of Sex, Death, Enlightenment was 700 pages long. And my editor looked at it and said, I don't know what to do with this. You need to cut it. So I holed myself up in a room with a good friend who was a brilliant editor and her red pencil, and we just went through it. And I cut 400 pages from the book over the period of that month. And it became obviously a much better book, but that was hard to do. I just had so much that I wanted to say. And the thing with memoir is you're not always sure what belongs and what doesn't because it's your life. And it's not like it's harder
What
to
what
make.
what do you mean by that, Mark? Sorry.
Well, it's harder to make your personal experience into a story because you sometimes don't have the objectivity to shape it and say, well, that may have been important in life, but it doesn't matter in the narrative. I didn't have that distance. I was too much in it. And so I needed an outside eye to help me cut away what wasn't essential and find what the actual storyline and what the through line was.
Right.
Um, when I wrote it, I thought it would be my last book. I thought that I was going to die, and I just threw everything into that manuscript, and then later had to shape it and prune it and polish it and give it direction.
And how did you make this transition into ultimately teaching other people about writing?
Yeah, I wasn't expecting to be a teacher. I never thought about teaching. I was a dyed-in-the-wool writer. It's all I ever wanted to do. And for 25 years, it's all I did do. I was fortunate enough in those days you could actually support yourself just as a writer. So I was very lucky. I wrote a few books. And then about 15 years ago, someone asked me to teach a class at a college in New York on memoir. And it was the strangest thing. I walked into the room of 12 people and I just knew what to do. I mean, I had prepared a little bit, but not much. I realized I just, it was in me. I had a lot of experience and all I had to do was share it. And people were responding and I realized that I could actually help people. And so it was very organic. It grew out of my life and my writing very organically. And one thing led to another, and it's now become almost as important to me as writing. I spend about half my time teaching and half my time writing now. There are
In my
things,
in my language, you've got what's the word? Double two callings or something. Like there's, you know. But I suppose in a way and also they're kind of there's a dynamism between the two, isn't there? It's kind of like
yeah, they
they
are. They're
feed
really
each
the
other.
same. That when I look at what I'm doing on the page, it's not that different from what I'm doing with my students.
Hmm.
Uh, they do feel it feels of a piece, and that's been the most amazing thing for me is how my teaching has developed on its own because I really never had any intention in that direction. I've got
Hmm.
lots of ego and lots of intentionality around writing. Teaching was because I never had any investment in it. I was sort of took us a back seat and said, well, let's see where this goes and follow it where it's going. And that's been a great freedom for me. Writing can become very egotistical and solipsistic and self-enclosed. Teaching, you have to be your best self. You really do have to get out of the way. It's not about you. It's service. You're doing service, even though you're paid for it.
Hmm.
And that exercises very different muscles from the ones I had been exercising for most of my professional life, which was all about how can I finish this book. And so it's been good for me. I think it's been good for my character as a person to kind of get beyond myself a little bit and not just be focused on my precious little career.
Mm. And what have you found, Mark? Like, writing is such a weird thing, you know. Sometimes I think of it in terms of it's like there's this creative instinct that won't leave me alone, you know. And in some people's language, it's like a daemon, you know. It kind of wakes you up at weird hours,
Mm.
and in some ways, it's like there's this libido. Like sometimes you know that you're kind of on, and then it all goes. You have a sleep or something, and you wake up and there's nothing, and you have to kind of learn to live with the what is it? The vagaries of libido, you know, that comes and goes, and you've got no control over it. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
The only control you have is to keep showing up.
Yeah, right.
Diligence and perseverance are the only control that you have, and
Yeah.
it can't be overstated how important it is to be regular in your work. And
Mm.
I say this to students all the time because you just don't know what's in you until you sit down to do the work. You know, there are many times I've thought that I had nothing to say,
Yeah.
and it ends up being a really good writing day. You know, on other
Yeah.
days I come to it hot and I come to it excited.
And then,
It just peters out, or what I've written is just no good. So you
yeah.
can't judge it, and so the job is really to get out of the way, keep showing up. The way
Yeah.
Flaubert said, you know, you need to be seated and at your desk for writing to happen, or wherever you happen to write. And beyond that, you're like you said, it's out of your control, and that's what I
Mm.
love about
Mm.
is that it's there is something coming through one that isn't being directed
The
by reason
ego.
or logic or ego.
Yeah. Beyond the ego.
Yeah.
And what are, you know, what are the main, this is what I'm trying to ask you, I guess, is writing to awaken. What's the main things you've found are really important? And I want to preface this by the fact that, like, I'm on Substack, you know, as you know, and there's just so many people writing, needing to write, wanting to write, putting stuff out. It seems like a huge thing for so many, or in my world anyway, for so many people.
Yes.
What are the main things you've learned from working with people and from writing to awaken? What's the main things you're trying to get across?
The main thing, there's a kind of a saying that I use with Writing to Awaken, that when you tell the truth, your story changes, and when your story changes, your life is transformed. That's something that just came to me kind of as a little egg, and it really contains the whole of what I'm teaching other writers. And when you break it down, it's about what does it mean to tell the truth? You know, we talk about telling the truth as if it were an easy thing. As you were saying earlier, it's incredibly difficult because we're lying most of the time. You know, every day of our lives we're, you know, prevaricating in some way, you euphemizing, you know, using, you know, protecting other people's feelings, nipping and tucking what we can say and how we say it.
Being agreeable is one of the worst things.
Being
Like
agreeable,
I heard
like,
someone the other day speaking about, you know, people who have that tendency towards being agreeable, which I could relate to in a sense, but it's like one hides so much of oneself behind
oh
the
yes,
agreeable.
oh yes. Yeah, I mean, psychologists call it reputation management. You know, we're doing it all the time. You know, how can I make them like me? How can I get what I want? How can I not be judged? And so there's this part of the mind that's watching itself all the time and protecting itself and filtering the truth through, various filters of fitting in, and not offending, and getting what we want and being loved, getting the love and support that we want. So we're not telling the truth most of the time. So that's the most important thing, is to recognize, particularly if you're writing memoir, you know, what is the truth for you? Not the truth with a capital T, but the small, changing, messy, human truth that's full of contradictions. You know, what is your truth today? How is that contributing to the story you tell about your own experience? Because, of course, we're always interpreting experience and creating versions of experience, which is called the narrative fallacy. You know, the way we put events together to tell a story while leaving out the majority of information. So we're doing that all the time. So we're creating fictions where then we're living as if those fictions are true. And we wonder why we feel lost and ungrounded or inauthentic. That's the number one things people who work with me talk about is feeling inauthentic in their lives and their work. So that's where we start. You know, what does authenticity mean to you? What are you hiding? You know, what stories do you tell on a regular basis that you know aren't true? You know, that's usually where I start with people. How are you misrepresenting yourself to yourself and to others?
And people
And
are
so
happy
then
to
we're
divulge
off.
that
Then we're off to
information?
the races, huh?
Are they
So,
happy to divulge that information, or do you just get people sitting there looking at you for a while?
well, usually they're shocked, and a lot of people will say, "What do you mean I'm not telling the truth? What are you calling me a liar?" I'm saying, "No, you're a human being, and we're all, you know, being dishonest in varying degrees a lot of the time." Uh, People who are not surprisingly have the biggest resistance to this are often the ones with the biggest cover-ups. So folks who come to me and say, "I'm an open book, I tell the truth all the time, I don't have any secrets," you know that they're the ones who are sitting on the whoppers. So we start with that, and folks, there sometimes I get pushback, but most of the people who come to me, knowing who I am and what I do, they want to open up. They just don't know how. They don't know how to access what the untold story, what Dorothy Allison called the scary story. You know, tell the scary story. When you don't want to write the authorized version of things. You want
Were you always like that when you were young, when you were writing, or did that really happen when you did Sex, Death, and Enlightenment, where that, kind of real story?
honestly, I always had that a kind of shamelessness about my work that has served me as a memoir writer.
Right,
I didn't have I have plenty of ego, but I don't have the particular kind of ego that wants to protect its secrets.
right.
I kind of I think maybe because I was such a lonely kid, I wanted people to know everything. You know,
Yeah,
I just wanted to overshare. So that wasn't that wasn't a problem for me. Like I said,
right.
I wouldn't do that today. You know, I'm
Yeah,
at 68. I wouldn't do it because one becomes a little bit more reticent, and also I've said a lot of this stuff.
yeah.
But that for when I was younger, when I did Sex Enlightenment, and when I did the my other memoir, The Woman Left Behind, sh- didn't have any shame about my experience. And I'm really grateful for that because
Mm,
that's what grabs people and pulls them in and also helps them access parts of themselves that they may be ashamed of. Because when you're brave on the page, you give the reader a doorway to their own courage.
I was thinking of the word when you were talking is permission. It's kind of like giving oneself permission is a huge thing, isn't it?
It
Uh,
is, and it's hard for people who want to write. You know, it's very hard for first-time authors sometimes to get over that critic,
mm,
that censor in themselves. Who do you think you
mm,
are? Why do you think you have anything to say?
mm,
It's so sad because I see talented people with fantastic stories who just can't get them down on paper because of this shame and this
mm,
kind of false modesty that they were trained to have,
mm,
and you don't want to stand out too much. And
mm,
these are the messages that they shut you down as a writer. They kill your
mm,
inspiration.
mm. And perfectionism a little sometimes. It's a bit associated with all of that.
Yes, and I, as a writer, I suffer from perfectionism on the page. That's one thing that I may be a little shameless, but when it comes to my prose, I rewrite endlessly. It's just, it's crazy. It's a little too much sometimes. I think it's important to keep the language loose, to keep the prose loose, and not over polish. So
Overcook
that's
it.
overcook it. So that's the challenge, is to know when to let it go, when it's as good as it needs to be. But nothing is ever good enough,
Mm,
for the artist. You never
mm,
feel like it's good enough. But I've also learned that when you over worry things, they actually get worse. And it's best to just, put it out in all its, unkempt glory, and move on to the next thing.
yeah. And what else have you? I mean, what else? Writing to awaken. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I think Carl Jung said, the aim is to become who you really are. But there's a lot of spiritual work in that, isn't there? There's a lot of, I mean, like you can say if someone told the truth, but it's kind of like, uh, what is it? Like there might be years and years and years of slow and patient work in a way to know more of oneself or whatever.
Yeah, it takes a long time. And very often people will write the first draft of something, and it's really just putting their toe in the water.
Mm,
And then in the second draft, they start to get down to the meat of what's really going on. And it takes, anything worthwhile takes at least 4 drafts. So as a writer, it takes years, but as an individual, as a human being, we talk about telling the truth as if it were some, easy thing. It's the
mm,
hardest thing
mm.
to peel back the layers of all the cover-ups, all the denial, the repression, the fear. This is a long, hard process. It's also, though, the only process worth engaging in. So
Yeah.
it's not like it's without reward, because
Mm,
wisdom is its own reward. Every time you have an insight, it inspires you to keep going. So it's not like you're just batting. Most of us aren't just kind of batting around in the dark forever. You're getting a glimpse of the light, or a glimpse of the truth, or a glimpse of change, of transformation, the possibility of healing. And that's what keeps you going. But
mm.
then it's more, it's more labor. And that's what seekers are all about. I really think the seeking spirit is enjoys the bucket work, the work of
Yeah.
going into the dark and really
Yeah.
doing that.
Yeah.
There's joy in that.
Well,
What could be more interesting than knowing yourself?
absolutely. And it's paradoxical because there is that kind of slow and patient bucket work, let's say. But I love that Italian word, viventius, the exciting insights, the life-giving insights. And to be honest, is there have you ever had a high as much as you've had from writing when you're really on fire or something like that, and you think, wow, this is one of the greatest highs I've experienced.
Yeah, there's no question. It's really my happiest place, is when I'm deeply immersed in a very challenging project.
Mm.
That's and it's not for everybody. Some people just they can't they don't like it's a marathon, and they don't like the endurance that it takes to keep showing up, day after day for years. You're doing something. It's a particular kind of temperament. For me, it's the best feeling in the world to really be focused on something I find completely fascinating but don't quite know how to do. So you're really
Yeah,
experimenting. And
just
when you
just out of reach all the
just
time.
out of reach, just out of reach. And I've gotten more tolerant and patient about it as I've gotten older. It
Mm.
used to be that I would beat myself up, or I'd think something was wrong, or maybe I don't really have an idea here. And now I know that it's there. I just need to I need to keep chipping away at the marble, to find out what's in there. You develop a kind of faith that's just based on past experience and
Mm.
what you feel in your body. After a while, you can tell, oh, that was a notion, not an idea. Or
Yeah,
that was a
right.
fantasy, not an actual calling. But
Oh,
when you
that was
get something
half
that
truth,
really
half
matters to
truth.
you, or a
Like
half truth,
it's got the kernel of truth in there somewhere, but hasn't quite reached it
ripened.
yet.
Exactly, exactly.
And other things, Mark, I mean, what are some of the other things with people typically that you find in your groups, in your classes?
People are struggling with so much shame. I mean, shame is it's like an epidemic. It's like an emotional epidemic, particularly in the West, where we have a particular kind of ego. And so helping people move through their shame, whether it's shame of not being good enough or shame of their desires, um, is it's inspiring, it's poignant, and it's also really painful because I see so many people struggling with this under this weight of self-hatred or expectations that seem unmeetable or just this sense that there's something fundamentally wrong with them. Some of it's religious based. I work with a lot of people who've, particularly Catholics, who have dealt with spent their whole lifetimes getting over this idea of original sin and feeling
Yeah.
like there was something wrong with them just for being born. How do you
Mm.
how do you work with that? Imagine as a child. I may perhaps did you have that as a child? I did not.
Church of England doesn't really have that. Well,
Right.
there's not much of a story in the Church of England, actually. It's just kind of normal life. Well, it seemed to me, anyway. And I used to think
Right.
at least the Catholics have a story, but part of the story, I noticed that when I went to India, though, is that if people were very, and I'm sure there's some Catholic people probably listening as we're talking, but if people had a strong Catholic orientation, that even in the meditation, which is totally not about original sin, which is about original beauty or something, to go into your original beauty, there was a dogfight because it's just and it's a funny thing, like I think sometimes with Christianity is that even if someone's not a practicing Christian, it's gone in deep somehow. This thing of
Yeah.
not good enough, not
Yeah.
uh, you know, wrong.
That you're fallen. You've fallen somehow. You're in this state of disgrace.
Mm.
You know, must know that famous story about when a group of psychologists visited the Dalai Lama, and one of
Right?
them asked about the problem of self-loathing.
Mm.
The Dalai Lama didn't understand, and he turned to his translator, and his translator, and he said, "Why would you feel self-hatred? You have the Buddha nature. You're essentially good." It just didn't compute to him.
Yeah, yeah.
This thing that is an epidemic for us didn't even compute for
Mm.
the Dalai Lama, and it doesn't for a lot of Indians, for example, that I've met. I'm not aggrandizing the Indian psychology. They have their own issues, but they don't
Yeah.
struggle with the same level of self-loathing that we
Mm.
do because they're not in a meritocracy like ours, where it's never enough and you're expected to be better than good, and keep climbing. And that has its benefits in a certain way, but it has a terrible shadow.
Well,
And
it makes people productive, but it brings that kind of fear and loathing and shame, perhaps, in your language.
yes, exactly. Yeah,
Mm.
exactly. I interviewed a guy yesterday who's the head of the Vedanta USA organization, and he was saying that in India, where he comes from, people don't have anything or much. He was talking about village life, but they're peaceful. He
Yeah.
said, they're peaceful, but they don't have a kind of a dynamism. In the West, we have more, we're more unhappy, but there's still this dynamism. And he was saying that what we nearly need is a third position, that
Mm.
has self-acceptance and dynamism. So
Yeah.
there's aspiration, and acceptance.
Mm.
We're not sort of all constantly at war with ourselves. And that's what I feel like we need to move toward, because this is not working. What's going on now in the West is not working.
So, what are some of the ways you approach that with people? Meaning, what is it? Is it to write the weirdest stuff you could think of writing, and pull the plug out or take the lid off the unconscious or something?
One of the things I do often is talk about desire. Desire is a loaded word for people. They associate it with sex immediately,
Yeah.
and all kinds of things that they think are kind of naughty. But
Mm.
desire is eros. Desire is the power of animation and dynamism, creativity. And if we don't know what our desires are, it's very easy to lose touch with our core, and our deep motivation and our will to live. And I can't tell you how many people I've worked with, John, who in their 40s, they feel like they're in the middle of their lives. They've and they have no they've done all the right things. They've dotted their I's and crossed their T's, and they've lost their joie de vivre. They've lost their deep desire, and the source of their passion. So what I do with them is work around what are your fears around desire. What do you imagine desire would tempt you with that scares you? You know, what is the power? How can you channel your desires into ways that are self-realizing and liberating and give you joy? I mean, it's not about satisfying every desire we have. It's not about instant gratification. It's understanding desire with a capital D. And it has kind of a bad rep, even in spiritual circles. People misinterpret what the Buddha said, but the Buddha didn't say desire is the cause of suffering. He said the craving and clinging to desire is the cause of suffering. If we didn't have desire, no one would sit down on a meditation cushion to meditate, and no one would read a book or listen to a podcast or care to work on themselves in any way. We need our desires, but we often
And
sacrifice them in the process of becoming good people.
because it's thought that there's this contract that if you're good and do the right things, that somehow God or some supernatural power will reward.
Yeah,
But what happens in the midlife is a bit of a shock in that,
yeah,
hey, I've done that for quite some time now.
right. I did everything they told me to do. Why am I why am I hollow? Why am I unhappy? Yeah.
But sometimes I think of it in terms of what really moves you. It's like, it's a funny thing in the West. You wouldn't think we'd be so Puritan, but it is very Puritan in essence, in many ways. But I could think more of someone like a William Blake or something, where it's like, maybe that's the real moral thing sometimes, is to know what really moves you, what engenders you, what awakens you, what enlivens you, all of those things.
Exactly. Exactly. If awakening is anything at all, it's got to be that. We talk about enlightenment. If it doesn't have that quality of aliveness to it,
Mm,
uh, what's it worth?
mm,
Where I just wrote a book about Ralph Waldo Emerson, and what I love so much about Emerson's work is that he's all about discovering this kind of glowing spirit within us, and his vision of human potential was like something I had never come across before. If we're not enlivened and revivified by our spiritual practice, whatever it is, it's not worth very much. This abstract idea of being a good person and therefore you're going to get all your rewards it's a con. It's a con of the church to keep people in line. Just do what we tell you to do, and you're going to get yours in the end. Well, I don't see it happening. And a lot of people who come to me as students are disillusioned by that and other sort of kind of fake stories that they've swallowed and just are not working for them.
mm. Yeah. Somewhere a long time ago, if you gave a certain amount of money in the Catholic Church, you could guarantee your place in heaven. So if you gave you $10, and people did it, like it was a good money making thing at the time. But
You know what P.T. Barnum said, don't you? That there's a sucker born every minute.
but it's kind of like going back into that call. But I want to talk to you about enlightenment because, being a bit of a young person, as you know, like I want to get what do you think about this? Is that I always get a bit nervy when I hear people say enlightenment. I think you were alluding to it earlier. Someone goes to India, has a big experience, very big maybe, and then might think that they're quite enlightened in a way. Whereas other people are just saying, oh, God, this guy's a pain in the ass. Like, how can he cut his legs off or something? But it's kind of like, I always get nervy because there's this dark bit, this shadow, this, uh, uh, you know, one can over-identify with enlightenment. And sometimes I think maybe in spiritual groups that, the politics is a bit more heavier than what it is out there in politics.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's absolutely true. I quote Jung all the time on this because I do a lot of work with the shadow, and Jung's saying that you don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. So one of the things I do with people, I've done in my own life and my own work, is going into the shadow material, including the golden shadow, including the things that we
Yeah.
suppress that are powerful and unique and original that scare the hell out of us.
Might be
We're
the
going
hardest
out.
things to own, is
Oh yeah,
the gold in the shadow.
yeah, yeah. So I'm fascinated by going into the shadow and erring on the side of shadow rather than kind of trying to dissolve into the light or becoming fixated with enlightenment, which can just become a lot of grandiosity and self-delusion. The most enlightened people I've ever met are the most modest and humble and usually kind of raunchy, good sense
Yeah.
of humor, not moralistic, not full of themselves, more than willing to admit their faults. Those are the people I want to emulate. Not some
Can
not
have a
some
laugh.
self-righteous goody two shoes, who pretends that they don't have a shadow. And there are a lot of those people out there, and they're the ones to fear because their shadows are in control.
I think, if someone owns their own shadow, then you can trust them a lot more. Because if someone's identified with the good, they'll project it all onto someone else's evil, some scapegoat.
Yeah.
And it becomes someone's not knowing perhaps how that's happening. That whole process is happening. That it's all being projected on someone else's evilness or whatever, and that it creates a great problem even within our society.
Oh,
Because
it does. No, it does. And that's why people like the Dalai Lama,
he's
he
earthy.
or completely earthy, and he refuses to be inflated by other people's estimations about him. A friend of mine had an audience with the Dalai Lama years ago, and he went in just full of adulation and flattery and say, "Oh, His Holiness, you are this," and he said, "Tut tut tut." He said, "You sound like the Chinese." Meaning, the Chinese who say that he's trying to set himself up as some kind of a deity. He rejects that, and all real spiritual teachers reject that kind of aggrandizement. They know it's nothing but ego under another disguise. Yeah.
And tell me one other thing. Let's. We're probably getting close towards the time, actually, Mark. But it's kind of like, what else have you found? Because you've had a lot of experience of working with people for a long time, and you've had a lot of experience as a writer. So what's one of the other things?
Many are called, but few are invited. I'd say in the sense that there are a lot of people. I'd say that 8 out of 10 people who say they want to write don't really want to write. They want to be writers. They don't want to do the work, but they want to be writers. They want to have a book, but they don't want to do what's actually necessary to make that happen. Of course, anyone can publish a book nowadays. You can just self-publish. It's so that a lot of those kind of criteria have been removed. But what surprises me and I need to be really aware of is the fact that 8 out of 10 people who come to do work on a book will abandon the project. And that's fine. That's as it should be. The world doesn't need more books. There are plenty, 60 some odd thousand books that are published in the United States every year. So the world doesn't. So I push back with students often in the beginning. Why are you doing this? If you're doing this to get rich and famous, if you're doing this so your, high school English teacher will finally, respect you, don't bother. You're not going to get those kinds of rewards from it. But if you're here
But
because you're
if you want to know
fascinated by the
more about
process,
yourself, and if you want
say
to
that
know
again.
if you want to know who you really are, then
Yeah,
this could be a great thing.
exactly. Yeah, and if you have patience and endurance and you're interested in the process itself, by all means, I'll work with you. If you're
Mm,
doing this to get a movie deal, find somebody else because
mm.
it's those are the folks who fall away within a very short time. So I'm learning to be a little more discerning about people that I work with and not expect things that are obviously not going to happen for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit like in terms of what is it? Our own development, our own growth. You got to stay with that as well. Like you have, it's kind of like it's
Yes.
that and writing are synonymous. You can't just kind of say, "Oh well, I'll do development if I get that outcome."
No.
I'll do personal development. It doesn't quite work like that.
And that's a really important point, particularly if people are writing about themselves, because you're going to meet yourself in the mirror of the page. You're going to see yourself with all of your warts. If you're not interested in that or prepared or willing to do that, it's not going to work for you. Writing, by definition, is the process of self discovery, and it's all going to come up. That's the beauty of it. So, for somebody like me, probably yourself, we're seekers. That's what makes it interesting. But for folks who think it's just going to be, they're going to scribble some things on a page and walk away, they're in for a big surprise. Yeah.
Oh, well, that's great, Mark. I just want to ask you one other thing. Have you been back to India? I mean, have you been to India a lot of times?
I've been to India 6 or 7 times. Yeah,
And,
the last time I went was when I was writing a book about Mother Mira, the teacher I told you about, and I went to India, I think about 5 years ago, to work at her school there. She has a school for impoverished children, and so I was there just for a couple of weeks, and I hope to go back. I'm not sure when that's going to be.
and you know, just tell us one other thing about India that you love, just to finish. Some way it's transformed you or changed you.
I love that life and death are not separate there. That the ugliness, the horrors of life, the things that we in the West do everything we can to sanitize, are really out in the open for everyone to see. And I think that creates a kind of uh, spiritual maturity and also a cohesion among in community when death is out in the open, when impermanence is glaringly obvious. It deepens you as a human being. It deepens you as a culture. And it feels like being at home. I said that earlier that I felt when I went to India, something felt like it came home because India shows you what you already know to be true, but may not be featured or allowed in your Western culture. There's a kind of shamelessness there that I
Yeah.
absolutely love. You can just let your hair down if you have hair, and just be
Getting harder for
yourself
me.
and be yourself. And there's something incredibly comforting about that.
I can remember, one of the first times being in India and someone had died and the body's kind of taken in. and all the friends and family are around. I suppose the Irish do this with a wake as well, by the way, but it's kind of like all the friends and family around, and people were taking photos, and it's kind of like, I don't know, the way I put it, in the West, there's a lot of stuff we're hiding, to use your language, in the way that it kind of makes that a proper transition if the body's out in front of everyone and you see it, and you know.
Yes. Yeah. They're not sentimental about death. I remember being in Varanasi and sitting and watching them perform a cremation on the Ganges.
Yeah.
And everyone was around this body. And then they lit it on fire. And then they're hacking it. Then they're breaking up the bones. And then the poor children are taking the bones and using them as sticks and playing games with them. It's a part of the fabric of life,
Yeah.
and I find that very liberating and really inspiring.
So out of the gods and the goddesses, which one would you kind of choose out of India,
I that's not
or
my
has chosen you?
that's not my scene. Really, I'm not a gods and goddess kind of guy. I really love non-dual teachings that have nothing to do with deities. Uh,
Non-Hindu.
yeah, no, I'm not a Hindu. No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mark, it's been lovely talking to you,
Thank you, John.
and thank you for sharing so much. And I hope you have a lovely evening over there.
Thanks so much, John. Thanks for asking me. It's nice to meet you.